Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Robin Lewis. I am a naturopathic physician practicing here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And today I want to talk to you about one of the most powerful and the most painful types of exercise, and that is Zone 5 cardio. So Zone 5 cardio is typically explained as 90 to 100% of your maximum effort. Or to be more specific, 90 to 100% of your max heart rate. So you're really revving things up. And if you think you're training at zone 5, the chances are you likely aren't. Because realistically, someone can only really sustain zone 5 training for about 10, 20, maybe 30 seconds if you're an extreme athletic individual. But for most of us, even if we are doing higher intensities of cardio, we're usually not reaching zone 5. This type of training is often referred to as HIIT training or high intensity interval training. Another way of describing it is sprint interval training, or SIT for short. And you often see this type of training in athletes, so people like cyclists, people doing the Tour de France, runners, more specifically sprinters, and things like that. But today I want to explain why the unique health benefits of Zone 5 can also apply to people like you and me. So even if I'm not gunning for an Olympic title, I can still get value out of this type of training. And I want to explain to you why you might want to consider this type of training and how to do it. Because there is a way of doing it properly, and you can definitely overdo this type of training. We will get to that towards the end, but you need far less than you might imagine to gain those health benefits that are unique to Zone 5. So, without further ado, let's dive into it. First thing is, how do you know that you're in true Zone 5? As I mentioned before, it is about 90 to 100% of your maximum heart rate. But how do you know what your maximum heart rate is? The formal way of doing this is through some form of exercise testing. Now, I personally did this at one of the clinics I work at called Revive, and we did it with something called Pnoe testing. And I'm wearing a mask that's measuring the gas that I breathe in and out, and we have a practitioner walking me through different exercises while I ramp things up to the point where I cannot go on any further. And then because everything's getting measured during that exercise test, which I did on a bike, they can assess, roughly speaking, what my zone 5 will be, and more specifically, what my max heart rate is. From there, we can really get formal about the type of training and the exact heart rates for me as an individual. Now, not everyone has access to this type of testing. For one, it does cost a fair amount of money. And for another, sometimes you just don't live somewhere that has this type of testing because it is fairly unique. So for those type of people, you can use a very basic formula. Roughly speaking, it is 220 minus your age to give you your maximum heart rate. And then from there, you'd figure out what 90 to 100% of that is. So for myself, being 30, it would be 220 minus 30, giving me 190 as a maximum heart rate. So 90% of that would give me about 170 beats per minute as my target goal for my heart rate. So again, you need something that's going to monitor it. I monitor mine with my Oura Ring. A lot of people have Apple Watches. Most of these devices will have the ability to measure your heart rate. So you're just making sure that at some point you reach that target heart rate, which using this formula for me would be 170. Now, when I did the exercise testing, mine was 143 to 166 for my actual Zone 5 training. So as you can see, these two numbers don't really match up. So it is preferred to do the exercise testing because not every 30-year-old will have the same max heart rate. But that is just to give someone who doesn't have access to these things a rough idea of a target you can aim for. Okay, so now that I've defined that for you, let's go into why you should even care in the first place. Why bother with this unpleasant but very cool type of cardio. In my opinion, probably the number one reason why you would want to engage in this type of training is to improve your VO2 max. So your VO2 max is a reflection of your heart health, your lung health, and your metabolic health. And it is very linked to longevity. Now, they have looked at this and they found that people in the top 3% of VO2 max for your age versus people in the top 25% will have a 5 times reduction in risk of death, which is huge. Now, how do you figure out what your VO2 max is? Again, you are using some type of exercise testing, and I did mine, again, using PNOE testing. That is not the only type of testing that will measure it, and in fact, it's not even really technically the gold standard, but nonetheless, it is much better than these rough formulas like I mentioned earlier. So let me back up quickly and explain what a VO2 max is. So this is a measurement of how much oxygen you can take in a minute based on your body weight. So how much can your lungs take in and how much can get absorbed into the bloodstream and circulated to your tissues and absorbed and used in those tissues for energy. All of that plays into your VO2 max. And so this is a measurement of oxygen intake over time. And so the VO2 max is when you've maxed the system out. You cannot get any more oxygen in. You are huffing and puffing and you've maxed the system out. And of course, the more you train, the more you can take in, the more metabolically active your tissues are and all of that good stuff. To break it down more specifically, your VO2 max depends on a few key areas. The first being the most obvious, which is your lung health. So of course, anything that damages your lungs could affect your VO2 max. But outside of these obvious things like lung conditions, what people don't realize is we actually don't often use all of our lungs to its full capacity. And so that's why a lot of these athletes who are really trying to ramp up their VO2 max will go through some sort of breathwork training, teaching you how to breathe in a way that maximizes all areas of your lungs, which for a lot of us, we're not actually doing. It may feel like we're breathing really hard, but you're not breathing efficiently. So your lung health is number one. Second would be your cardiovascular system. So how well does that blood take in the oxygen? There needs to be an exchange at the lungs that gets the oxygen into your bloodstream. And then how does your heart pump that to all of the tissue? And how well does it carry that oxygen? So the way oxygen gets into your bloodstream is through diffusion. So diffusion is when things follow a gradient. So it goes from an area of high oxygen to an area of low oxygen until those two areas match. So when it comes to your blood, the lower in oxygen it is by the time it gets to the lungs where it's going to do that exchange, the more oxygen that's going to get into the bloodstream. So if your bloodstream isn't very good at dropping that oxygen off to tissues, then by the time it makes its way back to the lungs, the oxygen concentration might be a little bit higher. Therefore, it's not going to drive as much oxygen back into the body. So it's actually of benefit to be able to drop off more oxygen so you can take more oxygen in. So this lends itself really well to my third point, which is what is the health of your tissues? And let's keep it specific to exercise and talk about your muscles. So your muscles need to consume that oxygen so that they can use it for metabolism to get more energy. So you're exercising, you're burning through your current energy stores, your body, or more specifically your muscles, will need more oxygen in addition to other nutrients to create energy so that you can keep going. And the more and more you do this, aka the more and more you exercise, the more efficient your muscles become at consuming that oxygen. So if you have a very healthy muscle and you're working it really hard, it's consuming a ton of oxygen just to keep you going. So by the time that blood has dropped off the oxygen to your muscles and made its way back to the lungs, there's not a lot of oxygen left. And therefore, at the level of the lungs, more oxygen is going to come back into the bloodstream because you have used up so much of it already by having healthy tissues and working them hard. So I hope that makes sense. It's all about your lungs, your cardiovascular system, and your tissues. And I think that's why it's such a good marker for overall health and longevity, because obviously if we can have healthy lungs, hearts, blood vessels, tissues, then that's a sign of pretty good health. And VO2 max is one of those very interesting ways of assessing that health. Now, it's just one element, but it is a very cool element. The other key benefit of Zone 5 training that I really want to emphasize in today's video is the fact that Zone 5 training can also improve the function and the number of mitochondria in your muscles. So if you guys are not familiar with mitochondria, please go back and watch my episode on mitochondria. If you want more of a refresher, please refer to that. But Zone 5 training can also improve the function and the number of mitochondria. Now there's some nuance to this. For Zone 5 training specifically, because it's such high intensity cardio, it improves mitochondrial function in a very specific way. Your mitochondria become very good at using sugar for fuel. Now, your mitochondria will primarily use sugar and fat for fuel. It can also use protein, but those are the two main ones. And depending on the situation, it's either using more of one or more of the other. It's never exclusively using just one of those two energy sources, but in lower grade cardio, you tend to use more fat for fuel. In higher grade, more intense types of cardio, you tend to use more sugar. So when they studied this, they found out that the mitochondria become much more efficient at using sugar for fuel. But the amount of fat used for fuel will stay the same. So it's not like you're sacrificing one for the other. It just improves how well you use sugar inside of that mitochondria. So it'll improve how well you produce energy, but in a very specific way. And the other thing they found is that it can increase the number of mitochondria. But again, it will do this in a very specific way. It'll increase the number of mitochondria inside of your fast twitch muscles. Now, broadly speaking, we have two types of muscle fibers. We have fast twitch and slow twitch. We actually have a couple subtypes, but for the sake of this video, I'm just going to say fast twitch or slow twitch. So fast twitch would be like sprinting. It's these Zone 5 types of training that use your fast twitch muscle because it's going to be a more explosive, intense type of cardio. So they found that the mitochondrial response to this type of training is to increase the number of mitochondria in fast twitch fibers specifically. So it's a really cool way of looking at it. It's not just mitochondrial health as a whole, but it is a very specific type of improved mitochondrial health, which is important nonetheless. Okay, so I didn't want to go into all of the benefits of Zone 5. Of course, there are a lot more benefits that probably apply to increasing exercise as a whole, but for the sake of keeping this short, I just wanted to highlight those two because I think they're really important aspects of Zone 5 that can apply to everybody, not just people trying to hit a certain athletic goal. But this can apply to everybody because we all could improve our lung, cardiovascular, and metabolic health. We could all use an improvement of our mitochondrial health if we want to live long, healthy lives. So I'm going to end today by talking about the ways you can train this. So something actionable that you can take away from today's video. So as I mentioned before, you can do HIIT or sit training. Both look very similar, and it doesn't really matter what you do it on. So you can do it on a bike, a Stairmaster, a treadmill. You can do some sort of like explosive squat jumps. Honestly, it doesn't really matter as long as it gets your heart rate up and as long as you're monitoring it. So I'm going to go over 3 different protocols, and this will give you a rough idea of how to start your training. So one example of sit training or sprint interval training would be 6 to 12 rounds of running as hard as you can for about 10 to 20 seconds. And your recovery time in between sets is designed to be 5 times as long. So say it's 20 seconds of a sprint, and then you're going to do 5 times that 20 seconds, so 100 seconds of rest before you jump into the next set. So as you can see, if you add that up, that is not an hour-long exercise. That is actually usually done under 30 minutes for most Zone 5 training. Because if you do it properly, you can't last that long. And I would encourage you starting to do 6 sets, not the 12 sets to begin with. And these sort of protocols are only really being done once, maybe twice a week. So you don't have to allot a lot of time to this. And this is why a lot of people will put it at the end of a lower grade cardio day, and then you'll just end it off with a Zone 5 or something like that. But that's one idea of how to train this. Now this next example I took from Dr. Peter Attias, but he was talking about how he VO2 max trains, which a lot of people use Zone 5 training and VO2 max training kind of interchangeably. But what he would do is 3 minutes of Zone 2 cardio, which is a much lower grade form of cardio, and then a minute of VO2 max, which I would argue he's not actually doing it for that full minute, but at some point in that minute, he's likely reaching those higher heart rates. And then he's going to repeat that 4-minute cycle for about 20 to 30 minutes total. And he also mentions that he does a full Zone 2 training workout, usually before this. So this is how he ends that cardio day, that big cardio day. And he only does this, again, 1 time a week. Now the third one was what was recommended to me based on my PNOE results. So I was recommended to do 10 to 30 seconds of Zone 5, followed by 30 to 60 seconds of rest. So basically just moving, so lowest type of cardio possible for 8 to 10 rounds once a week. So as you can see, you can kind of mix and match how you're going to do this, whether you do it for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, usually not much past 30 minutes, and you are always resting a lot longer than you are in Zone 5, because no one can sustain Zone 5 or VO2 max for very long. It's not really possible, even for these crazy athletes. So take it easy, start on the lower end, and what I always tell people is try not to increase by more than 10% each week. So if you're going to try and prevent injuries or burnout, which is very common with higher intensities of cardio, then start really slow and very, very gradually build up, because you do not want to overdo this type of cardio. It will not feel good in the body, and because it's explosive, it does put you at a higher risk of things like injuries, especially if you're doing it when you're completely exhausted. The last thing I wanted to end with is how long is it going to take for you to notice improvements in your VO2 max or to notice adaptations with your mitochondria? When they studied this, it actually doesn't take that long. So when they looked at VO2 max, when people are engaging in regular Zone 5 training, so 1, 2, maybe 3 times a week for these more extreme studies, they can notice improvements in your VO2 max in 1 to 2 months. Of course, the more you keep going, the more improvements you can see. But if you're doing things properly, it can only take a couple months before you start to notice improvements that you can measure. When it comes to your mitochondria, they start to be able to measure changes in the mitochondria as soon as 2 weeks after starting Zone 5 training. Now, if we're talking about increased number of mitochondria and some more significant findings when it comes to mitochondrial health, that can take closer to months or years. But either way, that's still incredibly impressive for something that you're likely doing for under an hour each week. So I really hope that you found today's episode helpful. If you have any other questions or things that you would like me to go over, please comment them below. I appreciate you all supporting me every single week, and I look forward to having you guys here again on my channel soon.